The John Lebang Show has been known to make people laugh, sing, think, scream, throw things in rage, and generally lose their minds. Listener discretion is advised.
Scheduled programming to bring you a show on the edge, broadcasting worldwide and out to the greater universe. You're listening to the John Lebang Show.
Greetings, Earthlings, and alert the media. John Lebang is here with my good friend, Derek Shelmerdine, and we're talking the best frontmen and women of all time. Derek, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, John. It's great to be talking to you again, mate.
And what an amazing subject we have before us.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think anybody could have predicted the results. I mean, really are some outstanding wins, and a lot of it was so close.
And for the people that don't know, you and I came up with a list of 32 of the best vocalists that we thought, and then we left it up to the listeners to choose and pick and choose through the brackets until we get to the final two. And we're going to talk about all these amazing frontmen tonight.
Interesting to see that three of them are actually members of the 27 Club. What we'll do is we'll go through it in reverse order, basically, and have a look at the people who didn't make it past the first round. And the first one of those actually was Ozzy Osbourne. Lost out to Alice Cooper.
That was amazing because it was going both ways. Ozzy just didn't have enough, but man, he had a lot of votes.
But I do love the fact that, I mean, they've been around, a lot of these guys have been around a long time before they actually found fame. I mean, Ozzy was in a band called Rare Breed with Geezer Butler, and they then joined the Polka Tulk Blues Band. Now, what a great name for a band.
Right, and that was around 1968.
That's right, yeah. And then they became Earth before becoming Black Sabbath. They did their first gig as Black Sabbath on the 27th of September 1969. And he was with them through until the end of 1978. So he had a heck of a good innings, I think, with Black Sabbath. But
and then he went solo after that.
That's right. He formed the Blizzard of Oz, and with Randy Rhoads, who sadly died tragically in a sort of prank that went wrong. He was in a light aircraft, and they buzzed the caravan that Ozzy was in. They were on tour, and unfortunately, the pilot either clipped the caravan or clipped the ground, and it was all over.
Ozzy has a weird taste in diet, doesn't he?
I mean, talking of frontmen, I mean, this guy is the guy who famously bit off the head of a bat live on stage. And what happened, that was on the 20th of January 1982 at Des Moines in Iowa. And what happened, somebody threw a bat onto the stage. He thought it was a rubber bat, so he just picked it up and bit the head off. Only to discover that it wasn't. The bat took a dim view of this and bit him back.
Right, he had to have rabies shots.
That's right. So he had a few shots as the tour continued.
I mean, when we look back at the matchup between him and Cooper, that could have went either way.
Oh, absolutely. And like a lot of these matchups, the lead kept changing over because they were so close to 50-50. It was often that people came up from behind and snatched it at the end, which is pretty much what Alice Cooper did.
Exactly. Now, Ozzy's on tour, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's all over the place from the 30th of January through to the end of July next year. You can find him if you're around in Ireland, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, Austria, and then he's heading all points south to New Zealand before he comes to the USA via Japan. So he's really going to be out and about next year.
And another great frontman was Kiss with Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. And they had an early matchup and didn't fare so well.
That's right. They were against Ronnie James Dio, and he won fairly convincingly on that particular one. But what a great band!
Yeah, and for two frontmen, one of the few in this large group of great frontmen that was carried by two people.
That's right. I mean, the whole makeup thing, I think, really sort of worked for them. And the names, I mean, Gene Simmons liked to call himself Demon, and Paul Stanley liked to think of himself as Starchild. I mean, they were both together back in the very early 70s in a band called Wicked Lester before they got together and formed Kiss. Did their first gig around the beginning of 1973.
For their first gig as Kiss, they rented a big old limo just to show up and act like they were big stars already.
That's right. I mean, there's nothing like, if you're going to be a rock and roll star, letting people know that you are a rock and roll star, I think.
Right, and they did lose pretty handily because they only got 44 or 42% of the vote to Ronnie James Dio, which we'll get to a little bit later here. But Kiss is on tour.
This is another one of those goodbye tours. They're calling this one the End of the Road World Tour, and they really are all over the place. Right across next year, from the end of January to the beginning of December, you can find them in Canada, USA, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Italy, Sweden, Germany. They managed to get to the UK before going over to Australia and rounding up in New Zealand.
Now, if people can't keep up with all the tour dates, they can go to your website, rock'n'rollunravelled.com, and click on the link for this show.
Absolutely. It gives what it is, the links are actually to the 90% are to the website of the band. They're not to ticket agencies. So what it does, it's the band's own tour site. And the link, as you say, is on my website, and it just shoots you straight across. You can see the dates and the venues, and in fact, on the website for all the other previous shows, John, all the people who were on the road that we've talked about for the last year or so, you can find their dates as well. So if you like gigs, it's a good place to check out who's going where.
Because the group has more than one front man. Which one did you like better? Were you a Paul Stanley fan or were you a Gene Simmons fan?
I'm probably more of a Gene Simmons fan, I think.
Yeah, he had the heavier music. Paul Stanley's a little more glammy.
Gene Simmons is one of these guys that's sort of packed with personality, I think.
Speaking of personality, now we're moving on to our next matchup. And this was probably one of the best of the first round. And that was Jimi Hendrix versus Angus Young, Bon Scott, and Brian Johnson, the AC/DC frontmen.
And surprisingly, well, not necessarily surprisingly, but Jimi Hendrix lost out. I mean, somebody had to lose. I mean, that was one heck of a matchup, and Jimmy came off slightly worse.
Yeah, and that would have changed a lot of things later on down the road if Jimmy had won.
But I think probably what it could be is people would often think more of Jimi Hendrix, I think, as a solo artist.
And a guitar player. And I think if this was straight-up guitar player, he might have beat Angus straight up.
Oh, I think he probably would. But it's worth just mentioning when we're talking about frontmen here, we decided to take a little bit of latitude and recognise that Angus, Bon Scott or Brian Johnson would be the frontman, and you wouldn't really think of the guitarist as being there. But with a number of these bands, what we decided to do was to actually take people who present themselves very much to the audience, which is why some of these have 2 or 3 people involved, like Kiss and AC/DC. And I think that was a good decision, actually, because I think that sometimes some people in bands get a little bit overlooked because they're not technically the singer. And I think it's good to bring to the fore some of the other people who are very much what the band's all about.
Especially in the case of AC/DC, where you have the guitar player who really is the image of the band, even though the singer is the front man. So that's why you combine stuff like that. That's why you combine Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley and some of the other things that the other groups we're going to get to a little bit later on. But Jimmy, he goes way back.
Well, absolutely. He was in his first band back in 1958, the Velvet Tones. Playing acoustic guitar, and then he was in another band, couple of bands maybe, before he went in the army. And he was actually in the 101st Airborne for a year or so. You know, the guys that were the band of brothers from the middle of '61 to '62. And he formed a band while he was in that. But when he came out, he spent good 3-4 years. Working very, very hard in America and getting no recognition at all. Sort of in 1963, he was in Little Richard's backing band. And one of the sort of urban myths that you come across is that one of the reasons he got kicked out of Little Richard's band was because he was taking too much of the limelight. So he was playing his guitar with his teeth, even back in those days.
And you can't compete with Little Richard.
Oh, I mean, another unbelievable performer. But it's Jimi Hendrix's problems all stem back to the fact that he signed a contract in October '65 with a guy called Ed Chalpin. And it was sort of after that, '66, when the Animals, the British R&B band, were splitting up. And they actually played their final gigs on a tour of America. And Chas Chandler, the bass player of the Animals, he decided that he'd move into artist management and have a change from being a musician. And he saw Hendrix at the Café War, and this is September '66, or it'd be August-ish probably when he first saw him. But he persuaded Jimi Hendrix to come over to the UK, and they formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And found immediate success in the UK. And it was when we talked about this, when we talked about Monterey in June of '67. That was when Jimi Hendrix really cracked the American market. But what's great about that is if you look at the posters for the Monterey festival itself, it says, "From England, The Who," and next to it, "From England, the Jimi Hendrix Experience." I always thought that was quite a nice touch.
Definitely.
But I mean, he's one of the 27 Club. Obviously, he died in 1970 at the age of 27.
Yeah, no touring for him, unfortunately.
No, sadly not.
But yeah, I mean, with Jimi Hendrix's rich career and how great of a guitar player he was, there's no doubt that he was one of the best to make this 32. And you know, it wasn't very easy, as you know, Derek, to put this 32, because there was a lot of... I've had people say, well, why didn't you put this person in? Why didn't you put that person in? And it was difficult to narrow it down to 32. We could have had 132, Derek.
Oh, without a doubt. I've had exactly the same conversations with people, and they're quite valid as well. I mean, there are a lot of people who score very high in these sort of polls that, you know, we didn't put in, because you've got to start somewhere. And I think we did choose an interesting mix of quite an eclectic mix, some of the guys that we are going to talk about aren't usually associated with these sort of polls, but I think there's really good reasons why they made it into our poll.
Yeah, we covered every style of rock music, even the fringes we're into the punk and as far as the commercial rock was concerned. And then when they were broken down into the brackets, they were kind of broken down into these subcategories, subgenres, so they had to kind of play out of their little grouping before they got to where it was more a wide-ranging variety of frontmen.
Absolutely. Some did very, very well as well. I mean, there's one particular, when we come to him, that I think did astoundingly well.
Our next one we're going to talk about, Stevie Ray Vaughan versus David Coverdale. Now, this has a little blues side to it because both guys kind of come from the blues rock background. Stevie Ray Vaughan didn't do so well.
No, sadly, he didn't. But he's probably not as well known as David Coverdale. And again, he's probably more of a virtuoso. I mean, it was his band Double Trouble, and I think it was their first album, Texas Flood, about middle of 1983, where he got some decent acclaim for that. And that album sort of revitalized the blues in the 80s, because it unlike the 60s and 70s, when particularly the early part of the 70s, and the blues backgrounds were very, very dominant, but they sort of fallen away for various reasons. And I think he was one of these blokes that really started to bring it all back to the fore again.
I would agree with you. If it was a straight-up guitar player category, he would have probably won a round or two. But not a lot of people will consider him a frontman because they consider him more of a guitar player. But he was the frontman of his group. Hey, Uncle Shady, where are they going? Hey, you, get back here. The John Lebang Show will be right back.
Check out the new book from Derek Shelmerdine,
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
It tells the story of rock and roll from its roots right up until the mid-70s punk.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Not just the music, but also the events that shaped the music.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
It includes the backgrounds to recording sessions, singles, album releases, births and deaths, epic concerts, and festivals.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Shelmerdine has made a painstaking effort to document pretty much every event that would prove significant in shaping popular music.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Purchase the book at www.rock'n'rollunraveled.com. Follow him at Twitter at R&R Unraveled, and look him up on Facebook at Rock'n'Roll Unraveled.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now.
Hey, man, you're listening to the John Lebang Show, man. The place where chronic brain cell rejuvenation happens. Feel like you're getting any smarter yet? Yeah. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us either.
No, he died in a helicopter crash in 1990. But I always remember, I can't remember which Frank Zappa album it is, but in one of the introductions, because he's always introducing the band, and an awful lot of stuff that Zappa puts out is live, even what you think are studio albums. And in one of them, he's introducing the band, and he says, "This is Stevie Ray Vaughan. He's a guitarist, and he does all the complicated bits." Which I think is quite a compliment coming from Frank Zappa, who I think is quite an accomplished guitarist himself, personally.
Oh, definitely. And that was a nice segue, Derek.
Because Frank Zappa's our next guy.
That's exactly it. Yes, sir.
And I mean, you very rarely see him in any frontman polls. But if you imagine, I mean, talk about frontman. I mean, I remember being at Zappa concerts, and he actually conducts the band in some of the trickier numbers. Now, if that isn't a frontman, I don't know what is really.
And I think you would have stood a little bit better chance if you didn't go up against David Bowie.
Oh, that's right. I mean, he didn't fare at all well. If you just looked at, the results, I mean, he was well trounced. But I mean, David Bowie is a guy who is a renowned frontman by any definition of the word, and a deserved win. I mean, I know I'm a big Frank Zappa fan, and I suggested Zappa for this particular poll. I didn't honestly expect him to do too well, but I mean, the guy is just unbelievable. I mean, if you think about personality, the whole ethos of being a frontman. If you imagine, way back in 1963. He appeared on the Steve Allen Show in America, and he performed his concerto for two bicycles. And what that consisted of on stage was him and two bicycles, and then he would play them with sticks and bows, spin the wheels, and it was really quite an awesome sight to behold. And it's that particular show is easily found on the internet, and if you're even the remotest bit interested in Zappa, it is well worth watching. And I remember at one point Steve Allen asks Frank Zappa how long he's been playing the bicycle, and Zappa deadpan says 2 weeks.
When you're talking about eclectic, you have two in this little matchup here that are very eccentric frontmen.
well, he just oozes out of all corners of the music. I mean, he bought his first recording studio in 1964, and he was busy. He worked there a couple of years before he bought it, and he was recording doo-wop artists and surf artists and all kinds of stuff. And in '64 again, he nearly had the first ever rock opera. He actually sent an outline of something he called "I Was a Teenage Malt Shop" to
great.
KNXT, a CBS, a part of CBS, and they rejected it. Now, if they had actually accepted it, that would have been the first rock opera and would have preceded The Who's Tommy by like half a decade. I mean, the guy's just all over the music industry. Absolutely incredible.
And he was recording that at his Studio Z, right?
That's right. Captain Beefheart was very much involved in all that with him at that particular time. And it was '65. He joined a band called the Soul Giants. They were a sort of bar band playing covers. And that was when they changed their name to the Mothers and started doing their own material. Well, when I say their own material, I mean doing Frank Zappa's material. And it was middle of '66 when their first album, Freak Out, came about. That was released by the Mothers of Invention because the record label wasn't keen on the band being called the Mothers. So they were insistent on extending the name out a little.
And it turned out to be a great name anyways, the Mothers of Invention. Great name.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, unfortunately, he passed away in '93 from cancer.
I mean, I mentioned at the top of the show that, three of the guys are talking about in the 27 Club. Somewhere around 19 of the people we're talking about have actually shed this mortal coil. And that's quite a big percentage, really, when you consider that we're normally talking about people who are doing stuff in the 60s and 70s, and a large percentage of them are still on the road. I was quite surprised when we actually put this all together, and I started analysing a little to find just how many had moved on.
Yeah, and a lot of the vocal, I mean, we spanned, like I said earlier, we spanned a wide range of genres inside the rock realm, and that means we took up a great deal of time period to make that work. So we included people from the late 50s, early 60s, as well as people all the way into the 90s.
That's right. I mean, that's why I was so surprised, because so many of these people are actually from, not starting their careers in the 50s and 60s.
One of the big names in rock and roll from the Van Halen band, David Lee Roth, he went up against Prince. That's
right. I mean, he lost out against Prince. It was a relatively close affair. But, I mean, he started out in '74 with Mammoth before they changed their name to Van Halen. But, I mean, he is one of these sort of legendary frontmen, really.
Extremely flamboyant. I've seen him in concert. He's a great show.
He does quite a lot of solo stuff as well.
Yeah, I think for a while there he was doing the whole Las Vegas thing, just like some of those other guys. Like he was doing the Elvis bit, basically.
Yeah. Oh, an awful lot of these bands now have a week in Las Vegas. I know we talked about the Moody Blues the time before, and they've got a week coming up in Las Vegas. So I think everybody has sort of fitted into their schedule now. It's no longer the whole cabaret circuit that it used to be.
And that gives us a nice segue into the next one, where it was Elvis Presley versus Bruce Springsteen and Clarence Clemens.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for me, certainly, if I'm thinking about Bruce Springsteen live, you couldn't think about Bruce without immediately thinking about Clarence Clemens. Because I think he was a very, very important part of that sound. And I think that's why, certainly live, Bruce Springsteen's so good, been so successful, but playing rock and roll. Because if you look back to the 60s, to the 50s rather, the instrumental break was the saxophone. It wasn't until the late 50s, 60s that the guitar became the instrument of choice, as it were. So I think when you've got a modern rock and roll setup with Bruce Springsteen, to have someone as good and with such a stage presence. I mean, he was a big chap, was Clarence. And I think he really complemented each other. But what was really quite surprising for me is that Elvis trounced him.
Killed him. Yeah.
Absolutely trounced him.
Springsteen and Clemens only got 30% of the vote. That's pretty decisive.
One of the biggest one. That was the same sort of differential as there was between Bowie and Zappa. Now, as you say, going up against Prince, going up against Bowie, your chances of winning in this sort of poll are not good. But I mean, he's been around. Springsteen's been around since the mid '60s. He was in a band called the Castiles. Joined them in mid-65 as lead guitarist, and it wasn't until about 71 that he was playing with a band that became the E Street band. Well, they were billed as a Bruce Springsteen band, and like an awful lot of others, like Velvet Underground, it was a college gig in New Jersey, and I do love it. At the bottom it says free entry, and it gives the rain date, and we don't have that in the UK, this rain check concept. But I mean, it's such a good idea. What I love, at the end of the poster, it says, "No dope, no booze."
Was that a Bruce Springsteen thing, or was that just the school thing?
No, that was the college. That was the college poster. It was, I forget, but the gig itself. I mean, it was probably the end of 10th of July. That would be the end of term, end of the year kind of thing, or maybe the beginning of a year. But no, that was the student union or whoever put the gig on. No dope, no booze.
And it just took a couple years after that he put his first album out.
That's right. Beginning of '73. Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey. But the great one is he worked very hard to find fame. There was, nobody can ever accuse Bruce Springsteen of being an overnight success. But it was the middle of '74 when he was playing this particular gig, and John Landau was there, and he wrote a review in the local paper afterwards, and that was when John Landau famously said, "I have seen rock and roll future, and that future is Bruce Springsteen." Sort of summer of '75 with his third album, Born to Run, that he broke through, and he brought that tour to the UK. He was getting massive hype. The posters the tour started in London, and the posters said that the world is now ready for Bruce Springsteen, and he was being billed as the new Dylan. Hard to imagine it now, but the reviews he got in that early European tour, particularly those London concerts when he came over in '75, they were very mixed. I mean, it was sold out. But he got quite mixed reviews, so he was certainly on a slow burn. But once he did pick up, and I mean, Born to Run really was the album that established him.
And it's interesting because when I look back at Bruce Springsteen, I remember him in the '80s, and to think that Born to Run came out in 1975, it just shows you how long and how strong his career went.
Absolutely. I mean, he of all of the artists we talk about, I mean, he's one of the really consistent ones, and he just goes from strength to strength. I mean, Clarence sadly died back in 2011, but Bruce Springsteen's, well, he's not so much on tour, he's doing Springsteen on Broadway, a one-man show, and I think that just shows. And he did the first run of 2 or 3 weeks, and that was successful, so he got extended and extended. And, looking at a couple of reviews, people like Rolling Stone magazine, he gets phenomenal reviews for this show. And it's just him there with his guitar harmonica, sings a few songs, tells a few stories.
And this still goes on till December 15th. So people still have a chance to see it.
Well, yeah, as you say, it runs through to December. And that's at the Walter Kerr Theatre in New York. But I was reading yesterday, in fact, it's now been announced that Netflix is actually going to stream it on their streaming service, starting when that finishes at the Walter Kerr on the 15th of December. So there'll be a chance to see this Springsteen on Broadway if you're a Netflix fan.
So that's after he's retired the live show. They're going to put it on as a continuation. That's great. And people who weren't in New York will get a chance to see it.
absolutely. No, I think that's great news.
And he was a former lead guitar player, but our next guy is the lead guitar player himself, and Mr. Chuck Berry.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the greatest frontmen of all time.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, if you look at all his catalogue of songs that he's written that have been recorded by just about everybody from that era and way beyond. But he was up against John Lennon and Paul McCartney, so sadly Chuck Berry didn't move past the first round.
Yeah, and I would have to say that Chuck Berry, of all these people, maybe add Elvis in with him, they're some of the original frontmen.
Oh, very much so. I mean, Chuck Berry, he's always been a performer. I mean, to put him into context, he released his first single in the summer of 1955. And his first single gave him a top 5 on the Billboard Top 40. But on the R&B charts, it gave him a number 1 for 11 weeks. Absolutely incredible for a first single. But I mean, he had his famous duck walk, and that started around that sort of time. Alan Freed, he's the American DJ, very much influential in bringing black R&B music to white audiences, and he was the guy who's accredited with coining the term rock and roll. And he used to run an awful lot of concerts. He was a promoter as well as being a DJ. And it was on one of Alan Freed's concerts that Chuck Berry started to do his famous duck walk in sort of late 55, early 56.
And he's a huge influence on a lot of the guitar players and frontmen that came after him.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, John Lennon famously said in the early 70s, he was on a TV show, and he was actually appearing, I forget which one it was now offhand, and he was appearing with Chuck Berry, and he famously said that John Lennon said that if you wanted to call rock and roll by any other name, you could call it Chuck Berry.
Right, exactly.
And to get a feel for the kind of stage antics, if you like, that people like Chuck Berry got up to. He was on tour in March of 58, another one of Alan Freed's tours, and he was on tour with Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, they were both massive showmen, and Chuck Berry was far more established. Jerry Lee Lewis had just started having his hit records, and he'd had a couple of really big ones in the charts, and they were arguing backstage as to who should finish the show. And Alan Freed decided that Chuck Berry should finish off because he was the better, more well-established artist. So Jerry Lee Lewis went on just before Chuck Berry. And Jerry Lee Lewis decided that he was going to really give it some welly. And he set his piano on fire at the end of his act. And apparently, when he walked back through the wings and past Chuck Berry waiting to go on, he said words to the effect of, "Follow that."
Don't move a muscle.
John Lebang Show, right back.
With lots of fun and excitement, yes!
Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning for a beautiful sparkling shine that's crystal clear. Call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
If you want to contact the John Lebang Show, feel free to send an email to jlebang@live.com. And if you're on Twitter, look him up at John Lebang. And don't forget to go to his Facebook page at The John Lebang Show. Banger. Now here's John.
The only reason he doesn't go on is because he's facing the Beatle twins, basically, in Lennon and McCartney, which, they're so famous.
There's no argument that the Beatles have had the biggest impact on the world of contemporary music. I mean, it's amazing that if you think that they had their first UK hit single in 1962. Love Me Do was their first in the UK, released in October 62. And by 1970, They all hated they don't necessarily all hate each other, but the band wasn't getting on. And in early 1970, they just split up. And here we are, a very long time later. They're just still to the fore in every poll that's conducted. Incredible.
Mm-hmm. Next on the list was maybe the most one-sided matchup we've seen the entire bracket. Noddy Holder against Mr. Freddie Mercury.
Yeah, again, Freddie Mercury is not the kind of guy you want to be trying to pitch against in this. But Noddy Holder's an interesting guy. I mean, he was a roadie for Band of Joy, which was one of the early bands that Robert Plant and John Bonham from later with Led Zeppelin in '66. And then he joined a band called the In-Betweens. And they were managed by Chas Chandler, which is the guy that managed Jimi Hendrix. So Chas Chandler managed Jimi Hendrix in the second half of the 1960s. They parted company around the Electric Ladyland era. And then he managed Slade. They were called Ambrose Slade. And then in '69, they released their first single. And he managed them throughout the 1970s up until the very early 1980s. But if you look at the difference, I mean, some of these people like Springsteen are equally well known, I think it's fair to say, on both sides of the pond. But if you look at Slade, and Noddy Holder was the lead singer, it probably won't be that familiar to a lot of American listeners, because in America they didn't have their first hit until 1984 with Run, Run Away. And they actually only had 2 American top 40 hits, both in 1984. But in the UK, it was a very different story. They had their first hit in 1971 with Get Down and Get With It, and they had 45 top 70 UK singles.
Could they not get a deal in the US, or was it just that their music wasn't hitting?
They just never managed to crack the American market. I mean, they were very big in the glam rock. That was the sort of UK glam rock scene over here. And the American glam rock scene was very, very different. So I think they were maybe too niche for the American market. Having said that, of that 45, 13 of those entries were for one song, which was Merry Christmas, Everybody, which has been in the charts 13 separate occasions.
Okay.
So it's Noddy Holder co-wrote it, and with a guy called Jim Lee, one of the other band members. And I've seen several times Noddy Holder refer to it as his pension, because you can imagine the amount of times it gets played across the Christmas period is absolutely amazing. Noddy Holder's actually gone into acting. He's been on TV things a number of times. He's a DJ. But the other 2 guys, the drummer Don Powell and guitarist Dave Hill, they've continued as Slade. And you can actually see them 30th of October through to the 16th of December. And they're in the they're in the UK between those dates. And in the middle of that, they pop over to the Ukraine.
So our next matchup, which was probably one of the least voted upon matchups, was Lou Reed versus Steve Marriott.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one. I mean, Steve Marriott from the Small Faces, and Lou Reed lost out to Steve Marriott.
Barely.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of them that was, I mean, just teach. In fact, Steve Marriott came up from behind because Lou Reed was leading for most of that voting, and then some Small Faces fans must have found the poll, and Steve Marriott just managed to snatch victory.
We had a lot of votes. A lot of people who weren't regular listeners of the show, weren't regular followers of Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. Hopefully they're tuned in right now to see these results.
It continues to get curiouser and curiouser when you look at some of the outcomes. But I mean, Lou Reed, I mean, what a doyen of the rock and roll industry. I mean, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, both in the Velvet Underground in 96 and in his own right in 2015. But I mean, he'd been around quite a while. Started out with a band called The Primitives. This story pops up like Whiter Shade of Pale, exactly the same thing. Released a track called The Ostrich, and it was recorded with studio musicians. So when he wanted to go on the road to promote it, he had to recruit some people. One of those people he recruited was John Cale, who later went on to be a fairly prominent member of the Velvet Underground.
Which had their first gig in 1965.
That's right, but again, you see that a lot because the period of 65 to 67 is a really interesting one. It was a real time of change because that sort of 64 to early 66, late 65 was the whole British invasion thing. So bands like the Velvet Underground, the Doors, and lots of other bands, American bands, were bubbling under, coming together. And really that was the creation of rock music itself. But if you look at that, their first gig was on the 11th of November 65, but their first album wasn't released until the March of 67. So that whole 1966 was a major transition period. Well, you don't tend to think about it now. You think rock's always been here, but it was sort of rock and roll developed into beat music. And it wasn't until sort of 65, 66 that it gave birth to the much harder edged rock music with people like Cream, Doors.
Yeah, you're talking like the concert rock bands and stuff like that.
That's right. And of course the bass guitar sort of popped up at the sort of end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. The amplification, if you look at films of the Beatles in stadiums,
right, you couldn't even hear them play. You couldn't even hear them play because the girls were.
That's right. I mean, it's not surprising. Look at the back line of a couple of Vox AC 30s, but then you motor on 10 years and look at people like Grateful Dead. Mm-hmm. And I saw this fabulous photograph of a Grateful Dead stack, and it was about 15 amps on top of each other. Absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, that's where the wall of amps came from.
I mean, another interesting guy. I mean, some of the stuff he's done, I think, is in a class of its own. Really interesting guy.
This is maybe the first show we've really had where there's not as many guys touring as they've been passed away.
That's right. That was what surprised me when I was looking into the sort of detail of it. That's what made me go through and just count how many people had moved on to the great gig in the sky.
Which segues us right into the next matchup, which is Lemmy versus Kurt Cobain.
That's right. I mean, that was really close, but Lemmy just missed out in the end. And he started out as a roadie as well. He was a roadie with the Jimi Hendrix Experience. What happened was he moved to London, and he shared a flat with a guy who was a roadie for the Animals and the Experience. And he got him a job briefly, I think it was about 67, as a roadie with Jimi Hendrix. So that's a good start to anybody's career.
If you're going to be a roadie for somebody, you want to be for Jimmy or for Eric Clapton or somebody really cool. You know, you definitely don't want to be John Lebang's roadie.
No, I can't imagine anything more cool, John.
So now we move to August 71, where he joined Hawkwind.
That's right. You don't tend to think of Lemmy as a part of Hawkwind, but he wrote songs with him and all kinds of stuff. And he was with them from the summer of 71 through to the middle of 75. And what happened was they were playing an American tour, and like a lot of American tours, sort of hopping backwards and forwards into Canada. And he was doing one of those trips from the US side over into Canada, and he got pulled up by the customs man who said, hello, what's all this here white powder then?
Busted.
Absolutely.
It was Canadian Mounties, probably.
Powder. But it turned out that when they actually examined it, it turned out to be amphetamine and not coke. And the Canadian Border Police lost interest at that point because they obviously don't worry too much about amphetamine in Canada.
Yeah, it's not coke, eh? So we can't bust you, eh?
Absolutely. But that didn't stop Hawkwind sacking him.
The rock band fired him over that whole thing. That's great.
Yeah, even though there wasn't there wasn't an ensuing problem because there was no litigation following, as it were. It's an ill wind, as they say, that blows nobody any good. And in the middle of '75, a couple of months later, really, he formed Motorhead. So I think that was a step in the right direction.
I was just going to say, what a great career move.
I've always been quite a Motorhead fan. I think Ace of Spades is still going to be one of my favourites. And on the same album, they got one called We Are the Road Crew. And that's another one I always quite liked.
Lemmy, it seems like he had to fight and scratch his whole career to remain relevant. And then he becomes the god of rock and roll when you listen to the movie Airheads.
And I mean, the guy just looks the part. I mean, some people really look rock and roll. And I think, Lemmy is one of the rock and rolliest looking people, I think, of all.
Our next matchup is one that you suggested, and this one actually turned out the way I thought it was going to turn out.
Yeah, there's John Lydon and Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. It's just, I mean, I thought that they just epitomised that British 18 months or so of 76, 77 into early 78 British punk. It wasn't really about the music. It was all about the attitude. And they really were the poster boys for punk. I mean, they got pretty much trounced by Iggy Pop, who was their big idol, of course. But I mean, they started out in the early 70s. Like a lot of people are around a lot longer than you think. And they were in a band called the Swankers. And it's an interesting name. I'm not sure if it translates in, but swanky is a slang term for being a bit posh in the UK. But if you take the S off and just leave it with the rest of the world, that's a sort of word that brings a snigger out in the UK, because it's a term for when you're
talking wankers, right?
Absolutely.
We're on some UK channels. Hopefully, I'm allowed to say that.
It's very borderline, and I know I know on trips to America, it's a word that isn't widely used in America. And what it means basically is when you're enjoying lovemaking, but you're there on your own, basically.
Yeah, well, that's what we would call it here. You're wanking it. So yeah, sure.
Oh,
Smoke them if you got them.
Because the John Lebang Show will be right back.
After this.
That's guaranteed. Yes.
Quality One Painting. For interior and exterior painting needs, call Tom at Quality One, 313-982-2986. Tom will give you free estimates, senior discounts, and I can tell you from meeting the gentleman, he's one of the nicest guys on the face of the planet. So for a quality paint job with a professional attitude, call Tom at Quality One Painting. That's 313-982-2986. 313-982-2986. Quality One Painting.
You're listening to the John Lebang Show.
It's what's cool on radio.
Now I have to admit, Derek, this next matchup, even though I'm gonna tell everybody, I put my vote behind Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend, and Keith Moon because I thought they were the better frontmen. Because I'm not a big fan of Led Zeppelin. I could have swore up and down that Robert Plant was going to run away with this.
He lost. That was one of the multiple matches that I thought really epitomised the band. Pete Townsend, the lead guitarist, Roger Daltrey, the true frontman, the singer, and Keith Moon. They were all equally important in being that group. And even the bass player, he just held it all together because he just stood at the side of the stage and hardly moved.
When I first had this matchup and we posted it for people to vote on, I thought Robert Plant was going to be one of the final four, or at least one of the top 8. And he didn't even get out of the first round.
No, I think that's probably the biggest surprise, I think, of the or one of the biggest surprises of the matchups.
It's not like he got beaten handily. It was very tight, 54 to 46%.
one of the surprises. Because, I mean, he got an interesting pedigree. I mean, in the mid-'60s, he was a band called the Crawling King Snakes, and he was with John Bonham in that. And then they were both together in a band called Band of Joy. And there's a great story about the Band of Joy. Might be apocryphal, but I don't think so. It's the first version of the Band of Joy. Daltrey was actually in, and they sacked him for some reason. So he thought, well, what shall I do? I'll form my own band. And what shall I call it? I'll call it the Band of Joy. So there were two Band of Joys. I thought that was a great story. I hope it's true. And John Bonham was in that as well. He was in that sort of later incarnation of the Band of Joy. And in fact, Band of Joy, that the Slade guy, Noddy Holder, was the roadie, as we mentioned, for them. He actually recorded, Roger Plant actually recorded a couple of songs with Alexis Corner as well, one of the sort of godfathers of British blues. Just before they got together with Zeppelin, he made a couple of recordings. I remember when we did the albums, 100 all-time best albums, as it were, they had a half a dozen in there. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, that's why I was surprised that the Who team, in the bracketing of these guys, there was kind of a rhyme and reason of putting guys up against each other, or gals, as we're going to get to here in a minute.
Oh, absolutely. I thought that the pairings were really good. I thought that was excellent, the way they were.
So up next, we had another very interesting matchup. It was very one-sided. I don't think it was as one-sided as the voting showed. I just think people, when they weighed the two, were just slightly more in favor of Jim Morrison over Janis Joplin.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both in the 27 Club, of course.
Yeah, you're right.
Which is, I mean, both from exactly the same era. And she was phenomenal. She was very nearly the 13th Floor Elevators lead singer. They offered, because she's from Austin, I think they were from Austin, and in the beginning of '66, they offered her the opportunity to be their lead singer. So if she'd taken that, who knows whether the career would have blossomed in the same way? Because I mean, she was with the Big Brother from the summer of '66. But, I mean, they were popular enough locally. But it wasn't until, again, Monterey in the summer of '67, June of '67, that really established it. They played on, I think it was a Saturday morning or the Saturday afternoon, and they got such a reception. They were invited back to the evening on the Sunday, and it really established Janis Joplin's reputation. Albert Grossman signed the band, and they got a contract with Columbia. I mean, she went on to form a couple more bands. I mean, she moved on from Big Brother, formed Cosmic Blues Band, and that sort of morphed into Full Tilt Boogie. And she was another one. A lot of these big guys were arrested on stage, after stage, in this sort of era. And in the back end of 1969, she was arrested at a gig in Tampa, Florida. Tampa, Florida pops up in a lot of these stories as well. And she was arrested.
Hey, we're on in Tampa, Florida right now.
And she was done for vulgar and indecent language, for shouting obscenities at the police. They actually did allow her to finish the concert, and she was arrested backstage and released on a bond of $504.
Coffee for everybody.
Yeah, a $500 bond and a round of drinks, please. Yes, thank you very much. And she ended up, she didn't actually go to trial. Well, she didn't actually attend the trial in absentia, as it were. She was fined $200 for that. But it was all over for Janis in October 1970. On the 3rd of October, she was, she wasn't there. They were laying down the backing tracks for the track Buried Alive in the Blues, which was the last vocal track to lay down. And then what happened was the following day, when she didn't turn up for the recording session, the road manager went over to the hotel she was staying at and found her dead in the bathroom from a drug overdose.
And they ended up releasing that song as an instrumental.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So they just kept it as an instrumental.
And she only died a week after Jimi Hendrix.
That's right. I mean, that was pretty spooky as well. He died on the 28th of September.
A lot of musicians were dying at that time.
That's right. I mean, Jim Morrison wasn't long before he followed in their footsteps and joined them in the 27 Club. But I mean, I've always rated Janis Joplin. I mean, she's done some awesome music.
Yeah, and you can't fault her for losing to Jim Morrison. Like I said, it was it probably just came down to I like Morrison just a little bit better. Mr. James Brown versus Levi Stubbs.
This is one of the I thought a little bit of latitude would be nice to include somebody like Levi Stubbs that you don't normally think of as I suppose technically is a frontman because he was the lead singer of the Four Tops and he did virtually all the lead singing. But what I love about the Four Tops is that they were together. They started out back in 1954 while they were at high school. Levi Stubbs, Abdul Fakir, Lawrence Payton, and Ronaldo Benson got together at high school and called themselves the Four Ames. But there was an Ames Brothers, so they changed it to the Four Tops. And actually, between 54 and 56, they actually did release 4 singles, one of them on Chess. But it wasn't until 63 that they started to get somewhere. I mean, wow, that's the best part of a decade. And they were signed to Motown, but they were signed to the Workshop Jazz label. And they were recording an album called Breaking Through that was never released at the time. But what they did for the first year or so when they were signed to Motown is that they were singing backing vocals for other Motown artists, people like Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson. But it wasn't until the summer of 64 that they were given the Holland Dozier Holland song, Baby I Need Your Lovin', and transferred onto the Motown label. And they released that. And from there, their career just skyrocketed.
Yeah, that's what made them famous.
They're probably my favourite Motown band. But what I love about Levi Stubbs, I mean, unlike the Temptations, who had a whole host of lead singers, and the Drifters, a whole host of different lead singers. Those same 4 guys were together until Lawrence Payton died in 1997. But he must have had offer after offer to go solo, but he always decided to stay with the group, and I think it was a good decision.
Definitely.
And the only original member now who's still walking this earth is Duke Fakir. And he's actually on tour 24th of November to the 15th of March in the UK and in America.
We actually have one more first-round matchup that I totally forgot about. And that's Axl Rose versus Mick Jagger.
But that was quite a decisive win for Mick Jagger.
Yeah, Axl didn't stand much of a chance.
I mean, Mick Jagger's been around, the Rolling Stones have been around since the very early 1960s, and very successful. I mean, they've been doing stadium tours, well, since the 70s, and they're still doing them. Absolutely incredible.
Guns N' Roses formed in 85, and they had their Appetite for Destruction in 87, which is a great album. But then they only have a couple other albums that are okay after that.
Yeah,
that's probably the biggest reason why Mick Jagger, because the Stones have put out good album after good album, and you can name off a dozen good albums from the Stones. Well, you can only name a few from Axl Rose.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's not really a particularly surprising result. But I mean, Axl Rose is interesting because, well, as you very well know, 2016 he teamed up with AC/DC when Brian Johnson developed the sort of hearing problems.
Yeah, famously, I was complaining about it the whole time. I was one of those fans, Derek. Maybe AC/DC hurt us though, but I was one of those fans that was just like, don't do it. And when they were doing it, now a lot of people really liked what he did with that group, but it was blasphemy because Brian had been in the band so long. But we'll talk about some of that stuff later. That's it for the first round, Derek. And it was an amazing first round. Did anything really stick out to you in that first round the most?
Well, just mention that Guns N' Roses are actually on tour November and December. So you were saying, John, stick. Well, the one or two of the surprises. I mean, as you were saying before, the Robert Plant Who one. I thought would have gone the other way. I mean, I actually voted for the Who in that particular combination.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're allowed to vote. We each got one vote, so it really didn't shake up anything.
I wasn't really surprised either about the Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. But I think what was interesting was that a lot of them were so close. I mean, if you take Lemmy and Kurt Cobain, I mean, they were neck and neck the whole way.
Again, they're two guys from different genres that had very different careers.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have left.